About a year and a half ago, I made a video titled MultiVersus What Went Wrong, where I detailed the history of the MultiVersus open beta and what eventually led to them taking the game offline before its final release. In the 18 months since that video, the WB game Smash Bros. Competitor was re-released, received 5 seasons worth of content updates, and then got shut down again. As the game prepares for its official closure date at the end of May 2025, I would like to reflect on how we got here. This is the story of MultiVersus, and this is the story of how not to save a game. I won't go into the whole history of the beta again, but the simple summary you need to know is that MultiVersus was released in open beta on July 26, 2022. The game was an immediate smash hit, totaling 20 million players across all platforms. At the time of this release, developer Player First Games said the game would be here to stay as it transitioned from beta to its final version. However, this did not end up happening. The open beta saw a steadily declining player count that eventually hit numbers so low, it wasn't sustainable to keep the game online anymore. So it was announced that the MultiVersus beta would be taken offline as they prepared to launch the full version at a later date. The beta was officially shut down on June 25th, 2023, and it was unclear at that time when exactly MultiVersus would return. In the months that followed, we didn't get any definitive answers. Warner Brothers and Player First Games were both extremely quiet, and some worried the game may not come back at all. It seemed as though the team had fallen behind schedule, as evidenced by a McDonald's collaboration in which MultiVersus themed toys were given out in Happy Meals despite the game being completely offline at that time. Yes, that actually happened. Finally though, we got some big news in March 2024 with a trailer titled The Road to Launch. It was here that we got new insight into the long wait. As game director Tony Nguyen describes it, the game was totally rebuilt from the ground up to support their new netcode in hopes of providing the best online gameplay experience possible. Additionally, they had moved the game to Unreal Engine 5, enhancing the visuals. Finally, they would be adding an all-new PvE mode, offering a single-player experience. With all of this in mind, the long wait became a bit more understandable, and everything they talked about was pretty compelling. As we got closer to launch, fan excitement remained high, but some started to notice a major point of concern. On April 11th, 2024, MultiVersus sent out a series of tweets meant to highlight their new netcode, but this thread was pretty quickly overrun by a different story. One of the tweets showcased a full match being played out, and the game looked incredibly slow. It was so bad that many genuinely thought the video had been uploaded in slow motion. When comparing this footage to the MultiVersus beta, which moved at a breakneck speed, the game was almost unrecognizable. Now, if there's one thing platform fighting fans hate, it's a slow game, so this was pretty concerning. For now though, it was unclear whether this was a strange video edit meant to emphasize the character movements, something MultiVersus has admitted to doing in the past, or a brand new speed for the game. For the time being, they were able to direct attention away from this controversy, as the rest of the pre-launch marketing was great. They further detailed their PvE mode, aka Rift mode, which looked to offer a pretty in-depth experience outside of pure PvP, something the beta was sorely missing. Additionally, they showed off the new characters we could expect at launch, with Season 1's theme centered around iconic villains including the Joker, Jason Voorhees, and Agent Smith. The core MultiVersus audience could not wait to jump back in, and newcomers seemed very intrigued by the additions. All signs pointed to a successful relaunch. MultiVersus finally returned on May 28, 2024, nearly 1 full year after its beta shutdown. Once again, MultiVersus saw red-hot player numbers out of the gate. The game peaked with over 100,000 concurrent players on Steam, just one of many platforms MultiVersus was available on. But as players began digging into the game, the overall response was pretty mixed. It was definitely slower than the beta, which was a somewhat strange choice, but it was acceptable, especially when playing in 2v2s, which was marketed as the recommended game mode for MultiVersus. And the overall presentation was phenomenal. Character designs, animations, and voice acting were all top-notch. Unfortunately, the solid core gameplay was dragged down by everything else. MultiVersus was littered with microtransactions and predatory game design features. For example, example, new characters needed to be unlocked with fighter tokens, an in-game currency, or gleamium, the premium currency that could be purchased with real money. As you may imagine, fighter tokens were a bit tough to come by. It could take you tens of hours to unlock just one new character due to how slowly you gained fighter tokens. There were ways to speed up the process, such as completing challenges or playing the Rift mode, but it was still pretty slow, and forcing players to engage with a game mode they may not be interested in just to unlock a new character is understandably frustrating. What made this problem even worse was the fact that locked characters were not even playable in offline local play at launch. So in a hypothetical scenario where a brand new MultiVersus player downloaded the game to play with their friends, they would only be able to use a couple different characters. And with no way to unlock these characters while playing locally, the game was basically dead on arrival for local play, a pretty pivotal element for any fighting game. For those who were playing online, the character unlock grind was extremely tedious, even when min-maxing the most optimal ways to earn currency. It's obvious that this was done on purpose to force players into spending money on the characters they wanted, and while I'm sure this helped raise gleamium sales early on, it was an extremely off-putting first impression. And as we'll see throughout this video, the overall damage this progression system did to MultiVersus was most certainly not worth whatever extra money they might have made in these initial days. Microtransaction issues aside, the final release for MultiVersus did leave some other things to be desired. Most notably, ranked mode was missing, something that was especially frustrating for longtime fans. Throughout the entire beta, players begged for a ranked mode, and it took forever to come out. Once it finally released, it was totally broken. To see ranked mode still not here on day one of the relaunch after a year of development time was not only confusing, but extremely disappointing. Other features present in the beta, such as end-of-game stats and leaderboards, had mysteriously disappeared as well. In some ways, this made the final release feel more like a beta than the beta itself. Additionally, the new PvE Rift mode was causing some controversy. Rifts are a sequence of challenges and missions granting rewards as you complete them. As a part of Rift mode, you would have upgradable gems. Equipping gems increases your stats and gives you various buffs. Rifts had multiple difficulty levels, with the higher difficulties requiring a certain gem level to be unlocked. You might be able to see where this is going. Getting your gems to a high enough level was an extremely tedious grind, unless of course you wanted to spend gleamium to level them up faster. Once you did reach the necessary gem level by shelling out money or by playing the same missions over and over again, you would quickly find the higher difficulties were extremely frustrating. It was that terrible kind of difficulty where instead of finding a unique way to make something harder, they just make the enemy character ridiculously powerful or nearly invincible. Another big complaint I had was that rifts were infinitely easier when playing with a friend, including challenges that required a second player. This was pretty annoying since it was marketed as the single player game mode. Rifts were a perfect representation of everything wrong with the day one launch of MultiVersus. You can see the good idea and concept, and then you watch in real time as it gets beaten down by the obvious engagement farming and microtransaction baiting elements. My overall conclusion of the final release of MultiVersus is that it was fine, but with some big glaring problems. For a player like myself who had invested a lot of time into the beta and really enjoyed the game, I was able to overlook it and keep playing. But for a brand new player, there wasn't much reason to stick around. And so it's not all too surprising that the player count began to drop, just like it had during the beta. By June 2024, the Steam player count had already seen a 50% decrease, with the peak concurrent player count being around 54,000. It is important to reiterate that MultiVersus was available on other platforms. So while people love bringing up Steam numbers because it's the most easily accessible, it doesn't always tell the full story. For example, Circana reported in June 2024 that MultiVersus was the 7th most played game on PlayStation 5 that month, which is no easy task. So while numbers had gone down a bit, MultiVersus was still holding on quite well in its first full month on the market. The question now is going to be, how will player-first games keep their audience engaged and coming back? To start, they had the typical new characters and maps with some great additions, such as Samurai Jack. They also added ranked mode, which actually worked correctly this time around and was nice to finally have in the game. Lastly, they listened to feedback and reworked progression and rifts significantly. There is no doubt that this was a fantastic first major update to the game. There were good character additions, a much needed ranked mode, and they listened to player feedback on progression and rifts. You really can't expect much more than that, but once again, player count continued to decline rapidly, with a peak concurrent player count of just 14,000 in July 2024 on Steam. However, before we continue on with that topic, an important event occurred in this same month. It was announced that WB Games would be acquiring Player First Games, officially making them part of Warner Bros. At the time, it was unclear how to read this move. On the one hand, it seemed to imply that Warner Bros. Was happy with the performance of MultiVersus, or at the very least saw some future there. Why else would you invest money into buying the studio? But on the other hand, WB has been a terribly run company recently, not only with their games, but all of their various forms of media. So fans weren't thrilled at the idea of WB taking full ownership of the game. Personally, I wasn't too concerned about this, as it was pretty safe to assume Warner Bros. Already had a whole lot of influence on MultiVersus to begin with, so not much would be changing there. I did feel like them going out of their way to purchase the studio was a somewhat good sign. It was clear MultiVersus was going to need some time to reach its full potential, and I hoped that this acquisition signaled Warner Bros.' willingness to support that. We would have to wait and see what exactly this acquisition meant for MultiVersus, but for the time being, Player First Games was going to need to get back to work because they were not out of the woods yet. The final release was following the exact same pattern as the beta, and we all saw how that ended. They were going to need to figure something out quickly. A boost did come in Season 3 with the release of the Powerpuff Girls. This seemed to be the biggest splash MultiVersus ever got from a new character release. Unfortunately, that addition was quickly overshadowed by an absurd 0 to death infinite move when using one of their perks. Player First Games quickly disabled the perk, but the damage was already done, with the clip going viral. It may not seem like that big of a deal, right? It was a glitch that was quickly addressed, but it was just one of the many examples where the developers could not get out of their own way. It felt like every time they did something good, like a new character that had people excited, there was always something alongside it that turned the conversation in the wrong direction. It's a big reason why so many people saw the game as a joke, or something not worth playing. Obviously, mistakes happen, and it's hard when you're a small team, but at a certain point, it just becomes unacceptable to have so many new problems with every big update. It pushes away your current player base while making potential new players unlikely to ever give the game a chance. MultiVersus already had a bad reputation, with many knowing it as the dead game that was brought back a year later, and these constant missteps were lowering that reputation further and further down. Player count hit a new low in October 2024, with a peak concurrent player count of just 2,721 on Steam. This was code red, and with rumblings of another shutdown, Season 4 would have to be a big one. The first major change came in the form of Fighter's Road, a new way to unlock characters. This was marketed as a way to streamline the process and make things easier. In reality, it kind of did the opposite. The previous fighter token method was a bit slow, but it worked fine. It allowed you to unlock any character you wanted once you saved enough tokens, whereas the Fighter's Road system locked you on a track, potentially forcing you to unlock multiple characters along the way that you didn't even care about. I think the process of getting a new character with the Fighter's Road system was technically slightly faster, but again, that added speed gets offset by the fact that you need to get through the whole track to reach whoever it is you really wanted. This became especially troublesome when the newest characters were being added to the end of the track. So if a new player wanted to hop into MultiVersus to check out the recently released fighter they were really excited to use, they would be unable to do so without wasting hours on a ridiculous grind, or spending money. Let me use Raven from Teen Titans as an example. She was the new character at the start of Season 4, and due to her popularity, a lot of people were pretty stoked about this addition. I found this old thread from the Teen Titans subreddit on the day the Raven gameplay trailer was released. As you can see, their community was extremely excited. There were several comments asking about what MultiVersus is and what platform they can play it on. People said they were going to download the game and give it a chance simply because they wanted to use Raven. This is the exact thing that MultiVersus needed. Unfortunately, every single person in this thread who went to download the game after seeing this trailer would quickly be met with a roadblock. In order to play as Raven, they would need to go through the entire Fighter's Road grind or take out their credit card. It's pretty unlikely that a brand new player who has no history or connection to MultiVersus is going to want to do either of those things. Not being able to unlock the character you want within a reasonable amount of time is super off-putting, and expecting someone to spend money before they even know if they like the game is pretty unrealistic. It's fair to assume that a majority of people interested in Raven who went to download MultiVersus quickly uninstalled it after figuring this out. This is evidenced by the boost in player count in the month of Season 4's launch, which then quickly plummeted right back down. What Raven and Fighter's Road represented was one of the core issues MultiVersus had. It felt like with each update, it was becoming harder and harder for a new player to jump into the game. Fighter's Road was actually pretty great for a dedicated player who already had all the other fighters unlocked, because when a new one came along, the grind was quicker than it was before. But for a new player, Fighter's Road was an insurmountable hurdle, blocking them from whichever character inspired them to download the game in the first place. This meant MultiVersus was essentially relying entirely on its already established player base, which is a recipe for disaster. If you're curious where I was throughout all of this, I was still playing MultiVersus nearly every day, despite some of my frustration with recent updates. But eventually, I reached my breaking point. In December 2024, a new patch came out with a variety of updates, the most notable one being the addition of shields, which would function just like they do in Smash Bros. This was the moment I gave up on MultiVersus. Not because I hate the idea of shields, but because it showed me how completely directionless the game was. Ever since the beta in 2022, the entire game had been built around dodging. The final release added an evolution of this with parrying if you perfectly timed a dodge. It made MultiVersus very offensive and movement focused. But now, after years of developing this system, they suddenly add shields in a random mid-season update. It felt like the developers didn't even know what game they were trying to make, and were just throwing random stuff at the wall and hoping it sticks. That made me feel like I was wasting my time by playing it. Regardless of how you personally felt about the addition of shields, it was another example of player-first games introducing controversial updates that alienated current players without attracting anyone new. I promise you, no one in the world saw MultiVersus add shields and suddenly decided they wanted to play the game. But there were players, such as myself, pushed away by this decision. Whether it was shields or Fighter's Road or whatever else, MultiVersus was slicing off sections of their player base with each new update, while simultaneously bringing in no one new. So what came next was not all too surprising. On January 31st, 2025, Player First Games put out a statement that fans had been dreading for months. It was announced that Season 5 would serve as the final season, with MultiVersus going completely offline a few months later on May 30th, 2025. With a peak concurrent player count of just 1,100 players on Steam in the month of January, this really came as no surprise to anyone who was paying attention. And so, for the second time in 2 years, MultiVersus would be shut down. I'm not sure we've ever seen anything quite like this before, where a game gets given 2 chances at life and ends up being taken offline within a year both times. It's especially surprising when you consider how much early hype and momentum they were able to garner during both their beta and re-release phases. In the weeks that followed the announcement, heartbroken fans tried to rally support for the game with a #SaveMultiVersus movement. It was nice to see the fanbase come together, and showed how passionate those who loved this game were. Unfortunately, the hype of this movement wouldn't last very long, as on February 25th, 2025, it was announced that Warner Bros. Would be shutting down Player First Games, alongside two of their other development studios. This was truly the final nail in the coffin for MultiVersus. With Player First Games disbanded, there was no hope for a Save MultiVersus movement, and no chance that the game could be brought back once again. As someone who played MultiVersus for hundreds of hours, and followed it since the very first day it was announced, I am extremely sad to see it go. But at the same time, it's fairly obvious to see how we got here. It seemed like the final release of MultiVersus focused most of its efforts on trying to find new ways to farm microtransactions, rather than creating any concrete improvements to the product. Whether that was the fault of Player First Games, or influence from their overlords at Warner Bros. Is up for you to decide, but it doesn't change the result. We all know that free-to-play games need these kinds of microtransactions to survive, but the way they did it in MultiVersus was just unacceptable. It felt more like a mobile phone game at times, literally being designed in a way to force the player to spend money. This may work in the mobile market, where children are logged into their mom's Apple account with a credit card attached, but most console and PC gamers are not going to be as receptive to this. The real irony here is that MultiVersus had fantastic cosmetics, and a content-rich battle pass which was certainly worth the money. So if they had just played it cool, I think they would have done just fine. Instead, they desperately tried to scrape any cent they could find as soon as possible. Not only does this make for a worse gameplay experience, it pushes away new players and ensures that they will not only avoid spending money, but probably avoid the game entirely. Speaking of attracting new players, this was one of the biggest elements MultiVersus could just never quite get right. The final release was a pretty great experience for anyone who played the beta, especially those who played it extensively. You got to keep all of your unlocked characters, currencies, and cosmetics. You even got the Season 1 Battle Pass for free. And with 1050 Gleamium being earnable through the Battle Pass, you could cover the cost of the next one if you fully completed it. So for a beta player like myself, I never even had to buy a single battle pass. Pretty sweet deal, and it was nice to see them give a benefit like this to their dedicated fans. The problem was, they never seemed to consider the experience of a new first-time player. That's a big problem, because this was the very group they needed to cater to the most. The beta had some very dedicated players, no doubt, but let's not forget that player count got so low it had to be shut down. They essentially built an experience that was great for the couple thousand people who had hung on to the beta, while ignoring the tens of thousands more who didn't fit into that camp. With progression and unlock systems that moved at a snail's pace, it seemed almost impossible to get fully invested in MultiVersus without having already been a longtime player or spending money. There's a reason why games like Marvel Rivals and Overwatch 2 have gone the route of giving all new characters for free. No one likes to feel left out. And while this fear of missing out may be an effective tool early on, as the updates begin stacking on top of each other, it becomes way too overwhelming for someone trying to start from scratch. MultiVersus never found a solution for this problem. In fact, I would argue their attempted fix, Fighter's Road, actually made things even worse. It goes back to our Raven example. Think about how many players may have stuck around and probably even spent money if they had just been able to play the character they wanted right away. It was a very hard-headed decision to never explore making all characters free before the shutdown. At the end of the day though, the monetization and progression issues were really just the cherry on top. The crux of the issue was that MultiVersus never quite found its foothold in the gaming space. It was never polished or stable enough to be considered competitive, but its various progression roadblocks stopped it from ever being played casually either. What this meant was that the typical MultiVersus player was just simply someone who already liked MultiVersus. They were never able to pull in anyone else. And in the end, although the MultiVersus community was quite passionate, it just simply wasn't large enough to hold the game up on its own. If there is one final takeaway I have, it's that MultiVersus is a lesson to game developers, and more so game publishers, to let games stand on their own before trying to milk them for all they're worth. If MultiVersus had placed a bigger focus on player experience and enjoyment, the money would have come through other means. I genuinely think that day one re-release first impression sunk the game before it ever even got going. The monetization and progression systems were just too anti-consumer. It really upsets me, honestly, because MultiVersus was a ton of fun and had so much potential for new characters and IPs to explore. Maybe in another universe, I would be finally playing as Mordecai from Regular Show, or Daffy Duck, or Scooby-Doo, alongside a massive fanbase that loved the game. Instead, MultiVersus will go down in infamy as the failed platform fighter that somehow managed to die twice. I hope you enjoyed this episode of How Not to Save a Game. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe. It helps out the channel a ton. And if you played MultiVersus, I would love to hear about your experience in the comments below.